Deadlift. Pick the weight up and put the weight down. Deadlift. Step 1 for nailing great conventional barbell deadlifts is adopting a stance that is roughly hip width apart. Now I say roughly because every stance will vary slightly based on how you're built and how you prefer to pull, but a good rule that I like to keep in mind is that I like to really leverage the quads in the deadlift, and I think they are highly beneficial, especially when breaking the floor. So adopt a stance that allows your quads to be highly active. Generally, we want the upper and lower leg to be working with one another, and if we're too wide or too narrow, then we might lose out on some of our quad activity. Step 2 is approaching the barbell and taking a midfoot position with the barbell over the midfoot. This means that the barbell, when you're looking down at it, will cover some part of the laces on the shoe generally. Now this will vary once again based on how you're built, but you want that barbell over the midfoot so you can maintain balance in your pull, but also it's gonna allow you to keep consistent with your setup. Step 3 is nailing your grip. If you're uncertain about your grip width, then a good rule to keep in mind and to try is that when you are bending down to pick up the barbell, the inside portion of the arm and elbow will be in a light level of contact with the outside knee. Then as you start doing reps, you can check your grip width by noticing how your grip is interacting with both your knees and what it looks like at your lockout. So basically we don't want our grip to be too narrow to where we're knocking our knees in. If you're knocking your knees, widen your grip slightly. And at lockout, we want a slightly more vertical arm position. So we're gonna have a more long arm position. This is gonna help us with the full range of motion we have to pull. And if we notice that we are out in like more of a V or an upside down V for that matter, then we might wanna bring our grip in. Step 4 is nailing a consistent hip position. And I think this is the part of the deadlift that trips up most and causes kind of that paralysis by analysis. So a couple things to keep in mind with hip position is that my hip position will look different than your hip position, and that's totally okay. Your hip position will reflect how you are built and how you prefer to pull and what allows you to lift the most weight possible based on your goals and needs. So that all being said, 2 things to think about when finding your hip position is number 1, if you start to pull and you notice that your hips shoot up before the barbell physically breaks or lifts off the floor, then you're gonna wanna raise your hip position up. That's often the problem that's going on with the hips rising too quickly. The second thing to think about is that when you are establishing your hip position, if you are getting ready to pull the weight and you don't feel tension throughout the hamstrings and glutes, then there's a good shot that your hip position is a little bit off. If you're feeling tension through the posterior, then that's a really good place to start when establishing consistent hip position, because the posterior muscles are gonna be our prime movers. And if those are not active and engaged before we physically start lifting the weight, then your hip position needs to be adjusted. Step 5 is now understanding how to set the back and create a more neutral position with the torso. So once you have your hip position, generally your torso position will establish itself once you bend down and grab the barbell. So some things to keep in mind is that you want to maintain a slightly more rigid torso position. Now do note when you start loading heavier, there will always be some level of flexion in the upper back and thoracic. That is normal. The spine is curved. So anybody who says you need a straight back, like they're not even in the conversation for what's actually going on in the deadlift. But that all being said, when we create this long arm position and we set our hips, we do want a slightly more rigid torso, and we want to maintain a positioning that allows our lumbar to remain relatively rigid. If our lumbar is going into greater degrees of flexion before we even lift the weight, then we're going to want to focus on our torso positioning and creating better tension throughout the torso. So step 6 is now physically creating that tension we just mentioned in step 5. So some things to keep in mind is that now that you are in your set position, how I like to think about this is I don't like the cue, put your scaps in the back pocket. I don't think it does justice for the deadlift. Plus it kind of misconstrues what that body part is even doing in the deadlift. So what I like to do and what I like to cue is to think about almost pulling your glutes to the barbell. So when you're thinking about your glutes and creating tension through the posterior, you want a nice stretch in the hamstrings. Think about creating tension by almost like closing the butt cheeks. And then as you do this, think about pulling the bar into you. This does not mean retract the scaps. We're not retracting the scaps. We're thinking about actively engaging the lats by pulling the bar in and forcing those glutes forward. This is gonna create a nice amount of tension. So as you initiate your deadlift, you're gonna have a nice synergistic pull with what's moving. You're not gonna shoot the hips up because these two aspects are tight, and you're gonna have better tension to create a more harmonious pull. So now that you've created that tension with the glutes and pulling that barbell into you, you're now gonna think about bracing accordingly for the weight at hand and pushing the floor away as you initiate the concentric. A lot of times we only think about pulling in the deadlift, but we can get a lot of benefit by when we initiate that pull, focusing on driving our feet into the ground and really leveraging our quads to push the earth away. So now once we have done that, we're gonna lock out. And something to think about is that when we hit our lockout, I like to think about squeeze the glutes, squeeze the quads, and just have a more relatively stable torso position. We do not need to go into hyperextension to show that we are locking out the weight. There's no need to add an extra range of motion where we don't need it. Plus, there's not a lot of benefit to putting the torso into this more hyperextended position when in lockout. So the final step is the eccentric or descending portion of the movement. So now that you've locked out the weight, you're gonna think about breaking at the hip and maintaining that nice rigid positioning of the hips and torso. And then as that barbell is traveling down in a more relatively vertical line, you're then gonna break at the knees once the barbell gets around like the mid thigh or just above the knee. Now I say just above or mid thigh because everybody's eccentric will be slightly different. And that is again based on how you are built. If you're a taller individual, you might have a slightly longer hip break where you are hinging a little bit longer. But a good rule to keep in mind here is that if you're uncertain of when to break at the hips and knees, if the barbell is traveling further away from the position in which it started, then there's a good indication that something's a little bit off with your hip and knee break. We want that barbell to remain in a relatively vertical path. It's not gonna be straight up and down. I don't like messing with straight lines. We are not robots, we are not forklifts. But if that barbell is floating away from you, let's say like 3 or 4 or 5 inches, then that's a good indication that you might be ramping the barbell down the thighs or breaking at the knees way too soon. So before we dive into the latter part of this video, I want to quickly say that how you execute deadlifts will likely look different than how I execute deadlifts. When we look at this guide, I want you to take away principles that we talked about for establishing certain positions, but then apply that to the context of how you are built and how you prefer to execute conventional barbell deadlifts. It is okay if we do not look exactly the same. I don't think enough guides talk about this, but we need to apply principles needed for basic patterns in the deadlift, but then scale them based on how we are physically built. But now let's dive into the muscles worked in the deadlift. So when it comes to muscles worked in the deadlift, we're gonna be working our glutes, quads, hamstrings, erectors, lats, traps, forearms, calves to some degree, and basically all of the core musculature that is present on the anterior and posterior side will be at play as we stabilize the weight through the concentric, eccentric, and locked out portion. We're gonna have a lot of muscle involvement, and the involvement will change slightly based on how you are actually executing your deadlifts, but those are the main muscles you can expect to work in the conventional barbell deadlift. So now I'm gonna go through 10 frequently asked questions that I get about the conventional barbell deadlift, and I'm also gonna timestamp them down below, so if you wanna jump ahead to any one question that you want answered, feel free to go ahead and click there and just go ahead and jump. But the first question I often get is, my hips are rising too fast, what do I do? So the first thing is just raise your hip position and see if that mitigates the issue. But if you're still having a form problem with your hips rising too quickly, here's what I would recommend doing. Number one, take a lighter load. So whatever that looks like for you, this could be 135, this could be 95 pounds. Get set and then video yourself from the side. And now what you're going to do when you are physically moving the weight and you have the video on is you're going to stop right at that mid-shin angle and pause for just a second and then go back down. You're gonna repeat this process and see where the hip movement is starting and why it might be starting. If you are doing this and you notice that your hips are shooting up too quick, then you have a nice side view of this happening. So raise your hips slightly, repeat that process, and then if that's still moving, raise your hips slightly, repeat that process. But this nice abbreviated range of motion is going to allow us to really hyper focus on what our hips are doing. And by videoing it from the side, we can then get an objective and consistent analysis of where our hips should be when we are deadlifting. Another common question I get is that I'm losing my grip. How can I improve my grip for the deadlift? So my first tip is to, number one, use double overhand more. A lot of times we default to mixed grip, hook gripping, or straps, when in reality, if we just want to build a better deadlift grip, we need to just put in the work with double overhand. I know it's a pain in the ass, but it will seriously pay off. Another way, if you don't want to necessarily go full double overhand for a full block and drop your weight and you still want to pull heavy weight with your say mixed grip, hook grip, or straps, what you can do is when you are working up in your warm-up sets, work with a double overhand grip, and then once you get to your working sets, then go with the grip that's going to allow you to move more weight. By doing this in your warm-ups, it's like a sneaky way to build up and accrue more grip strength. I've also talked about grip strength before in a video. I'm gonna link that up there if you want a slightly more detailed approach for improving your grip, but that's often the recommendation I have for folks who wanna improve their deadlift grip. You just need to deadlift more with a double overhand grip. It sucks, it takes time, but by adding more warm-ups where we are doing this, by adding holds even in our warm-ups on some of our top reps, it can be a really nice way to accrue additional grip work volume and acclimate our grip to the deadlift. So now speaking of grip, another common question I get is when should I switch to mixed grip, hook grip, etc. So an easy way to approach this is that once you get to a weight or load that you cannot physically hold with double overhand without some form of form discrepancy, then you're going to want to switch your grip. Now, generally speaking, I personally love hook grip. Maybe that's because I'm a masochist, like check out that nice rip of my thumb from last night's deadlift session, but I like it because it's a very secure way of pulling. It does take a little bit of time to acclimate. I filmed a hook grip video before, so if you want to try it out, check that out. But mixed grip is also another popular option. And without overcomplicating this question, whenever you get to a load that you cannot physically move once again with your double overhand grip, you're going to want to switch grip styles to something that's a bit more secure. And that's going to be based obviously on your goals for the deadlift. Another great question is what type of shoes should you wear when you deadlift? So a lot of folks will pull in slippers, they'll pull in their socks. And the reasoning for this is it's a flatter surface. There's gonna be like a zero drop, which means that we are not gonna be elevating the heel to any degree. This is beneficial because as we deadlift, if we elevate the heel, it's only going to increase the range of motion we have to pull. So some good options if you don't have slippers or if you can't pull in your socks in your gym is a Converse. This is a zero drop shoe. And then also cross trainers can be a really good bet when they have lower heel to toe drops. This Nike Metcon 4, for example, has a 4mm heel to toe drop, which is relatively low, but generally for shoes and footwear, you'll want to try to limit as much of a heel elevation as you can. The next question we're going to dive into is when should you belt up for your deadlifts? So there really isn't a one size fits all answer here, and every coach and athlete will have their own approach, plus it will be very contextual, but a good rule of thumb that you can apply to hopefully your situation is that once you get to a movement competency with the deadlift where you understand the mechanics, you're starting to load a bit heavier based on your goals, is that once you get to weights where you do notice your form starting to break down, then a belt can be a useful supportive strength tool. So let's say you're working at triples with like 85 or 80% of your 1RM. If you start noticing your form break down, whether it's on the first rep or throughout one of your sets, then a belt can be a really useful tool. There's no one size fits all answer here. And if you are a strength athlete, then a belt is more specific for your goals and needs, and that changes the whole context of this question. So that all being said, there is no like 2-plate, 3-plate, 4-plate rule. It's gonna be based off of what allows you to perform your best. It's gonna be based on your goals and what allows you to perform deadlifts without huge form discrepancies. Now, speaking of deadlift performance, another common question I get is, what's the easiest way to increase my deadlift and improve my deadlift? Deadlift more. Best way to improve your deadlift is to simply have more exposure to the deadlift. The deadlift is a skill. It is not just an exercise that we just go perform willy-nilly one day. It is a skill. We need to have dialed in mechanics to perform it. And the best way to improve at a skill, especially a highly technical skill like the deadlift, is to just practice it more. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily just go throw on a ton of load and hit deadlifts 4 times a week. It means being strategic with how you're practicing the skill, how you're training for strength, whatever the adaptation it might be that you're going for, and then using accessory movements to accommodate your overall deadlift performance. So to wrap that up and keep it simple, if you want to increase your deadlift, you just need to deadlift more and be very strategic with how you are doing that. Another common question that I get in regard to deadlift performance is how often should I deadlift? So that's going to be entirely based on your goals with the deadlift. Now, if you are trying to program higher frequency or less frequency, I have filmed a detailed video on that. I'm going to link it up there. So I'm not going to dive too deep into the logistics in this video on this question. Another common question that you'll see, especially asked on Google on generic fitness sites, is will the deadlift increase your squat? Technically, anytime you're increasing muscular strength and size across the board, you'll generally see an increase in other lifts, but the deadlift and squat are both different movements. So if you're looking to improve your squat with your deadlift, I would recommend looking at variations that are way more specific to the squat and the musculature needed to perform great squats. Another great question that I get is, can and should beginners deadlift? That depends. Beginners can absolutely deadlift once they have some basic competency of hinge patterning and the deadlift in itself. So I have filmed a hinge video, check that out if you are trying to learn the hip hinge, but also other variations like the kettlebell deadlift, like the dumbbell deadlift elevated on some plates or boxes can be great tools to acclimate yourself to a barbell deadlift, but beginners can absolutely deadlift. Now, do they have to? No. The idea that beginners and everyone needs to deadlift is just so erroneous, especially when it comes to the barbell deadlift. Like, there are so many other deadlift variations out there that will give us similar benefits. Now, will it be as specific to maximal barbell deadlift strength? No, but if your goals as a beginner are not necessarily barbell focused or even really making or getting a bigger barbell deadlift, you do not need to barbell deadlift to improve your back and posterior muscular strength. Are deadlifts a must? And similar to our beginner facing question, no, they're not a must. If your goal is not necessarily to improve your barbell deadlift, you do not need to barbell deadlift. Let's say your goal is just to generally improve your posterior strength, maybe your back muscular hypertrophy. There are so many other variations that will help get you there that are not going to be nearly as skill driven or taxing as the barbell deadlift. So the idea that you have to barbell deadlift to build a strong body, like, that's just so, it's so frustrating because there are just so many ways to approach this and there's so much context needed that forcing a barbell deadlift on somebody who doesn't necessarily want or care about their barbell deadlift is just plain stupid. All right guys, that wraps up this deadlift guide. Hopefully you're able to take something away from this video. I plan to create more deadlift content in the very near future, but as always guys, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one.